This is a Dirshu Mishnah Berurah, Simin Vav Sif Beis, as we continue within the halachos of Ashar Yatzar, L'Kai Neshama, and in truth, other assorted related morning halachos. So we begin Sif Beis, says the Machaber Yishnaigen, there are those that have the Kosan Lahamtin Levarich Al Natilas Yadayim, that they delay and they wait until they break the brach of Al Natilas Yadayim, Adbayim the Beis HaKnesses, until they come to Shul. Umisadron, and then what do? They say the bracha of Al Natilas Yadayim Umisadron Isai, and they say it together im shar brachas with the rest of the brachas. Bnei Sfarad loinagu kain, and those of Sfaradi, Bnei Sfarad do not do this. And of course, this touches upon the halacha that we've already seen many times. When to make the bracha of Al Natilas Yadayim? Do you make it first thing in the morning? Do you make it when you get to shul, etc.? Says the Ramah of Al Kol Panim, but says the Ramah, one has to be careful. Lo Yavarich Bifnei Atzmai. Lo Yavarich, Beis Pamim. Do not make the bracha Al Natilas Yadayim 2 times. To Misha Varchim at Beisai. Lo Yavarich Beis HaKnesses. You make the bracha at home, don't make it at shul. Chay Misha Varchim Beis HaKnesses. Lo Yavarich Beisai. Kol Beisim and Beis. That you only make the bracha 1 time, either in shul or at home, but not both. Misha Loimi Kodim She'achlis Beis HaKnesses. Someone learns before he comes to shul. Oy Mispal before he comes to daven. Oy Mispal Kodim She'varch. Oy Mispalim Kodim. Either if he learns in the morning, or he says, or he davens, then what should he do? Yivarchem bebeisa. You should make the bracha of Al Natilas Yadayim in your house. V'lo yivarch beis HaKnesses. Then you should not wait till shul, because you're going to be doing something before davening. So make Al Natilas Yadayim then. Va'afilu b'chai gavna yesh noigim l'sajin and shar brachos. Even in this case, in which you're learning or you're davening early and only then you're going to shul, there are still those that have the custom to make the bracha in shul beis HaKnesses. Ve'im varchem bebeisa in the Maharil in Hilchos Tefillah. So we go back and we begin Sif Beis. Says the Mishnah Berurah, they're those with the custom to hamtin, the wait. They're those with the custom to hamtin to make the bracha until they come to shul. Says Mishmur Sivkat and Zayin, Kabbalah mi Rav Yudah Chassid. There's a Kabbalah from Yudah Chassid that Ayetzu basically his own leaves his house, go to shul. Kaidim she'yisbal before he davens. Yemer basik Shema Yisrael. Say the basik of Shema Yisrael. Avi yechavi you should have intent shaloi lotzeis bazam. It says say the Kriya Shema. You should have intent to not be yotzei the mitzvah of Kriya Shema elim kain, unless you're Shavers man Kriyishma, unless you're nervous, you're going to miss this man, and then it would sound like you should have in mind to yes, be yotzei the mitzvah. By the Kvam 7 Menvav, Mashkam the Mishnah Berurah Sham. So he just quoted an interesting Kabbalah from Yudah Chassid that he would say Shema every morning before davening. It says that the Mishnah Berurah, but have kavanah to not to be yotzei, unless you're in a situation that you're going to miss this man. Let's see one more Mishnah Berurah before we see some Dirshus. Levarich Sivkad L'chas V'dav Kamalech Miyal Beis HaKnesses. It's only if you're going right away to shul. Avlim Loimeirach and Atila, if you're going to learn V'kolshkei Shamasik B'sicha B'teila, you're going to do other type of idle chatter V'achar Zeh Oilech Beis HaKnesses, and only then go to shul. V'varich Sham Atila Zedayim L'kulei Alma Lo Yavit Shabra. It's not proper. Tish Hefsik Gadol Bein Atila Brach L'mam L'kilah Mei. You're having a large hefsik between the washing of your hands and the bracha, and therefore that you should not do. Arkan Oisam Sha'imrim Taylor Kodim Atila Zedayim L'Yavit Meisim is not correct. That we hefsik Gadol, so you should not wash your hands, have a large hefsik, and only then make the bracha in shul. Kasav Alavosh Oisam Sha'imrim De'elim Toiv Yoiser. If you say tell him in the morning for davening, it is better. She'imrim Kodim Atila Ayin Shamatam, and that is a lavash. So before we get into basically the real, not real, but the main discussion of today, let's begin with Dirshu note number 1, discussing this Kabbalah of Yudah Chassid to say Shema in the morning, and it says, it explains the Dirshu. Let's say someone is weak and he's able to eat before davening, which of course shows us someone is not weak, so that we'll see later on it's a Beitas. They are not allowed to eat anything before davening, aside for obviously the requisite water, coffee, tea, etc. But with regard to eating, you're not allowed to unless someone is weak, someone who is sick, someone who has to take medication, etc. So let's say that person is eating something because of his illness, etc. You should always say Shema beforehand. See where you're allowed to drink. But again, if one is going to have to eat due to health reasons, explains in the Mishnah Berurah later on in 7 Beitas, it is better to say Shema first. Continues Dirshu note number 2, in which the Mishnah Berurah said you should have intent to not to be yotzei. What does that sound like? That sounds like, let's say you didn't have intent to yes be yotzei. Are you yotzei? It would sound like yes. Sounds like the only way to not to be yotzei is to have specific intent to not to be yotzei. But the Dirshu over here goes along to quote some lengthy steeras between the Shulchan Aruch and Vav and the Berurah and Samach Beis. And the take-home point, as we'll see in a moment, is what we're machmir both ways. We're machmir that mitzvah is tzricha is kavana. We're machmir that whenever you do a mitzvah daraisa, you want to have kavana. So when you're saying shema, etc., you have intent with the mitzvah that you're doing. But we're also machmir on the other side of the coin that mitzvah is ein tzricha is kavana, and therefore when we want to not to be yotzei, we're as well having intent to not to be yotzei. And now note number 3 points out, unless you're nervous that you're going to miss Man Kriyishma, Dirshu points out, what if you're going to miss the earlier Zman? And he quotes the Allah, you should have intent, yes, be Yotzei. And finally, he quotes from Sivim and Vav, Sekot Lamalf, and Dirshu note number 4, should have intent, like the din of Kriyishma, V'gam Yechavein, to be Yotzei the mitzvah. Some say you have to read the entire parsha, not just the first parsha. Some say just the first parsha, the Pri Chodesh and Chayadim say all 3 parshas. And during the week with tefillin, you also have an issue, because we know you're supposed to say Shema with tefillin. We'll just point out that what one should do, as we'll see later on, is any time one is saying Shema before davening, whether it's he's nervous, he's going to miss the Zman, he might miss the first Zman, etc., you should always have in mind an intent, a tanai, a stipulation that if he makes the later Zman, he of course wants that to be his mitzvah. Why? Because that's what he's saying Shema with the minyan, etc. If not, then he wants this one to be yotzei. And finally, Dirshu note number 5 and 6 discuss. Let's say you can have a long break between the Tilas Yadayim, and that would you make the bracha and shul. He says that the Berurah above, as we've seen, quoted the Beis Yosef, that says that according to the Rashba, that again the fundamental machlokes is Rashba and Rosh, why we wash our hands. According to the Rashba, the whole reason is because you're a Bariya Chadasha, you're a new entity, a new creation in the morning. Then you're allowed to make the bracha later on because you're still a new you're still a new entity. An hour or two later, even though there is a Hafsek Gadol. And he says, because of this reason, the Berurah says that if someone is going to have a long time till he davens, what should he do? Since he's going to end up having to generally use the bathroom another time, therefore you should make the bracha now, because you can end up, the opposite. Because you can end up using the bathroom before you daven, you'll have to rely on this Beis Yosef, you'll use the bathroom before you daven, then you'll wash your hands, and you'll make this al Tis Yadayim and the bracha of Ashar Yatzar. And then he quotes over here a different minhagim, Dirshu number 6, whether Tillim should be said before davening, after davening, etc. And now we continue in the Mechaber, in Sif Beis over here, not in the Mechaber, we finished the Mechaber in the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, going on Sifkat and Tess, in which we said the Bnei Sfar lo nagu kain, Berurah comments, Vaskamas Archoina Linen Kanshi Sfar, that's what we should do. Shalahafstik, Letchila Memirchal Tizayim, not until you do not want to have a Hafstik, a separation between the bracha and the washing. Miyad shenoto yadav zar levarich al tizidayim. Immediately you make the bracha. Achem beis shenoto yadav uzar lenikav. Of a classical story, you have to use the bathroom when you wash your hands. Shafilu b'divrei Torah, sir. Filu yachal amad. That's what Abar saw. Even if you could hold it in for 72 minutes, ein lo levarich al tizidayim. Achas esracham until you use the bathroom. Then you're going to make the al tizidayim and the Ashar Yatzar. Says the Shar Tshuva. Finally, come on to Sadi Beis Eval Vago Mishnah Berurah Sham. Vayin Lau B'Semin Dal Mishnah Berurah Sheksamdu Sham. All these Mekayos we have seen. Shema Chayadam. Here's this famous Chayadam again. Shalachat Chila Yisar Toiv La'amtim Levarich Al Tilas Yadayim Ad Acher. When should you make the bracha? Says the Chayadam. You should wait until Shemanaka Atzma. You clean yourself. Rutz Lisban. You're ready to daven. Does because then Yoitzil Kuliyama. Then you Yoitzil Mitzvah according to everyone. That is the Chayadam, and we mentioned back then there are many who have such a minhag. There's also a practical reason that you're saying the bracha in shul. It's easier to have kavana, and that is what many people do. Vayin shambir alacha shekazamdu the toiv sha'azi yisader achar rechs l'tzidayim v'shiyatzer kam shar brachas ha'shachar. Peralacha comments, if you're waiting for al tzidayim, if you're waiting for ha'shiyatzer until you get to shul, you should say the other brachas. But if it's a mayriya chayadim, that's what chayadim is talking about when he says shekasav yotzer l'kuli hama. Vayin shambir alacha shemaisarav. Because of gam king chayadim, it's not only chayadim, it's a vilnei goyim. The Gra as well wrote the same Kol Makom Ha'Isik Shari Tshuva Yesh Lo Gam Kein Al Lismach. So a bit of a win in Machlek is going on over here. On one hand, we have the Chai Adam of the Vilna Gaon telling us to specifically wait to make the bracha until you get to shul, but then there are other sources, as the Mechaber himself wrote, to make it right away, and that is the reason why the Mishnah Berurah says, whichever way you do it, you're going to be fine. Says Mishnah Berurah, if content Yod Shemavarcha Bebeisai, Ein Magad Rabbi Begadim Mishar Achronim Sheskimu Jafilu Shatz Shabirech Bebeisai Shavlei Var Beisigin Asas. Even if someone who was supposed to be the Sheikh Sibur made the bracha in his house, cannot make the bracha again. To be Amenu, why? In our days, Akol, Bekiyam, all women know how to read, all people know how to read, Cholechad, Mavarich, La'atzmai, V'inarata, Lirza, Lotzei, Zerberchas, Hashat, and we don't want you to be Yotzei, the bracha of the Sheikh Sibur Adkain. B'makom, Sheminok, Shashat, Taimer, Kol HaBrachas, B'Sibur. Let's say you're in a place, which many shuls do, of course, that the Sheikh Sibur says brachas before davening. Come on, you're going to say, no, like in our places. Sheminok came, you may be him. No Rayim and Yom the Rayim Shemavarich Bar Sibur Gamal Dil Zidayim Ashar Yatzar Uberachas HaTorah. They don't only make Berachas HaShachar, they also make Al Zidayim Ashar Yatzar and Berachas HaTorah and Shul on Yom Kippur. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Yizayir, be careful. Metchila Shal Levarich Chayzav Bebeisa Atzvik Brach in your house. Vehemira Shekvar Birachas Bebeisa Yer Levakish Lachem Shamim Shadayin Lo Birach. As someone else who did not make a bracha yet, Shechavin Lasid Berachasai to have you in mind. Oz Yezoyer Ashatz Ma'oid Lashmiya Kol Lashon HaBracha. Be very careful of every word. Look how much Nagin needs a makim Shashatz Mashmiya Rak Loshet Tchilas HaBracha. Not like those that the Shatz, the Sheikh Sibur that says the beginning of the bracha of a save at the end. The Kiva, the Shekavanasei Azva HaBracha. L'hoitzi, you're having intent to be Yoitzi Sarach HaShemea. You have to have intent Lashmiya Kol Lashon HaBracha. And as if God in Yod Aleph explained the Ramah further that brachas. He says, even in this case, this is that similar chayadim on the goyin, if they make the bracha, always everything in shul. Says Mishmur of cutting it out. The majority of people do this. This follows slichos. The dam slichos early in the morning may ask slichos. V'sham askirun kama psukim may have say psukim. If you have to say psukim, that's called Torah. You should have to say brachas Torah. But yet, says Mishmur, you know what they do. V'achar kach mevarchan al tisidai brachas Torah. Lenin brachas Torah usually. It's not such a big deal. The only say that it's psukim of Torah and derech tefillah. You don't have to go bracha and berachas Torah if he does. He's a bicycle and many bicycles as far as Simon Menvav. Sif that's God. We'll see Mirz Hashem in a few months. In fact, you have a large break. It's not simple to understand. Should not do this. Make the bracha right when you get up. Don't make the bracha anymore in shul. Or that was it. Pick your poison. Either make the bracha when you wake up and don't make it later, or don't make the bracha when you wake up. Then what do? You give the gatzma, use the bathroom, or yatal mayim, vishav shev and robo v'yantos mevarich, the oz mevarich. Al Natilas Yidayim Ashar Yatzar Yisrael K'moch Exam El Shema Chayadim, which again, as we mentioned, many people have such a minhag, and many people find it more conducive to having kavana, saying the bracha in shul. We move over to Dirshu and go straight to Dirshu note number 8. That quotes the Bir Halacha in the name of the Derech Chaim, that if you Mishla Yizker Shem Chiluk Rashba. Again, that same Rashba we mentioned in the beginning of this year, that why do you make the bracha until Yadayim? It's because you're a new creation. Therefore, it suffices to make to wash your hands in the morning, and not to make a bracha a second time. It's v'nal altil sedayim, and you should not say ve'in loymar sheichavin ozal altil rishon. Do not have intent backwards, as we have seen. Shalachatchila yishli zoyer, says the Dirshu note number 8. Shaloi lavso, says a gadol important rule. We keep coming back up time and time again. Should not have a large separation between the tila lebracha l'chein adiv levarich miyad. Allah Natila Rishon, you should make a bracha right away. But let's say it happened that you're in your house and you made a bracha Says Dirshu note number 9. Someone else, someone forgot. Someone else says Hashem Zalman, you see something incredible. You see the bracha of Ashar Yatzar is Berachas HaShevach. You're praising Hashem because if it was Berachas HaNenin, how could someone else make the bracha for you? So what's he Berachas HaShevach? But he continues and he says, there's no raya that it's a Berachas HaShevach. Why? Because only Ashar Yatzar in the morning is Berachas HaShachar, Berachas HaShevach. Says Rishon Zalman, in the morning, that's when we're going to say that the bracha is a Berachas HaShevach. But any other time, you're making the bracha very well, might be a Berachas Han. And in the next note, at the end of that note, he talks about being Yaitzi someone less than 10 people. And therefore, we're going to stop over here. It's a bunch more Dirshus in which he gets involved in Berachas HaTorah, he gets involved in the Shem Hashem, etc. We'll pick it up here, Mir Hashem, from Sif Gimel in Sivav tomorrow.